Kai Chan here. He's a professor. But first of all, Kai is a family man, because I'm sure he's going to refer to his family during the course of the presentation, even though it's not here. I've heard him so many times speaking about his family, so that's where I think a lot of his work comes from. Is inspired by, I feel, and I relate to that very much, because I know where that's coming from. So he's a professor at the Institute of Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC, and he's an interdisciplinary, problem-oriented sustainability scientist. So that's curious, interdisciplinary, and trained in ecology, policy, and ethics from Princeton and Stanford universities. And he strives to understand how social, ecological systems can be transformed to both better and wilder, to be both better and wilder. So that's also interesting to hear. Kai leads Chan's lab, that's connecting human and natural systems, and the co-founder of CoSphere, community of small planet heroes. So that's also interesting. So he's a UBC Killam Research Fellow, a Leopold Leadership Program Fellow, the director at the board of North American section for the Society for Conservation Biology, a lot of credentials here. So senior fellow of the Global Young Academy and of the Environmental Leadership Program, a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, artists and scientists, lead editor of the New British Ecological Society journal, People and Nature, a coordinating lead editor for the IPBES, the Global Assessment, and a Fulbright Canada Visiting Research Chair at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So we present to you Kai.
Thank you very much, Lalith and Gabriella, and all for hosting me here. I'm really excited about this conversation. Similarly, I'm a big fan of Limits to Growth and the work that the Club of Rome has done over the last 5+ decades. So it's great to have this opportunity to have a conversation with you. I feel bad for burdening Lalith with the long bio and all those things. The most of them, don't need to be said, but some of them do relate to what we'll talk about today. So I'll bring up some of them as we go. The issue here, Club of Rome is an organization that is fundamentally about sustainability, and here with the Values Committee, my talk is going to squarely bring those two together. And the basic premise of this talk is that sustainability is about unleashing values that are already present. And I'm going to address some issues that Chandran raised already in our conversation this morning, and then also in his very brief remarks right now about whether sustainability will require a kind of restriction of freedoms or actually the enabling of new freedoms. And I'm going to present a view that might, that allows for the possibility of either on a track towards sustainability. None of you really need to be reminded about the kind of dire straits that we're in at the moment with the planet. These two graphs are relating that problem from both a climate perspective and then here from a biodiversity perspective. In both cases, this graph coming from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it shows the kind of trajectory that we are on and the way that we're going to need to change that trajectory of global temperature change in order to maintain livable conditions on planet Earth. On the lower graph, this is bending the curve analysis about reversing the decline of biodiversity so that, again, we can maintain a livable planet that also is life-fulfilling as well as life-sustaining. That's going to mean radically changing the nature of our institutions in order to promote the reversal of biodiversity loss. We're not on that trajectory yet. One of the things that Lalith mentioned is perhaps the most pertinent for today's talk, which is that I'm a coordinating lead author for the global assessment of the IPBES, or IPBES, which is the kind of sister or brother to the IPCC for nature and nature's contributions to people. So Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. If you've heard of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, this is the official follow-on, officially endorsed by hundreds of member nations. They commissioned the global assessment to understand better the state of nature, its contributions to people, and what we can do about it. I have the pleasure to be the lead on the Solutions Pathway chapter, so what we can do about it. And I can't present any of those details here as part of the assessment because I have to first ensure that they are approved by plenary in a month and a half in Paris. But nevertheless, some of the thinking that went into that assessment is, of course, also in this work. And at the basic core of that is this notion that we need to do things quite radically differently. And yet that doesn't necessarily mean tossing out our existing institutions, right? And so we're going to be walking through that argument right through the rest of this presentation. I'm going to start by giving an introduction to this notion of relational values, which all of you are familiar with in concept, although you may not have heard this term before. I'm going to use a very brief example of how you can embed these kinds of values in the design of policies and programs with the example of incentive programs or payments for ecosystem services. Then we're going to talk about certification and the same kind of challenge of finding ways for people to express their relational values in that context. If I have time, I'll take a brief segue and talk about consumers and how the power of consumers for sustainability is currently deeply fettered and how we need to unfetter that. And then I'm going to briefly touch upon two other primary tools for sustainability, place-based approaches like spatial planning or ecosystem-based management, and then also regulations, including, although I'm not going to talk about it specifically unless you ask, environmental impact assessment, which my lab also does work on. And then I'm going to talk about one possible initiative that can bring together these various tools and unleash them from some of their fundamental limitations from a sustainability perspective. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but potentially there's something in that could really be helpful. The classical way of understanding environmental values or values about the environment, why the environment matters or why what we do to the environment or about the environment matters, is through two separate kind of academic lenses of value. One of them is the idea that nature has intrinsic value, that it matters regardless of our perspective and what pleasures we derive from that. That's the kind of preservationist view for nature. The second perspective is the instrumental value, that nature matters because of what it does for us, the kind of fulfillment or pleasure that it brings to us. This kind of conservationist perspective that, this is the Gifford Pinchot to the Muir. That conservationist perspective is associated with the notion of ecosystem services, which is something that I've been working on for the better part of the last couple of decades. Up until a few years ago, these were the only two value shows in town in the environmental movement, in environmental studies, and conservation. But a couple of years ago, we expressed another set of reasons that people care about the environment and act towards conserving it or preserving it. And these we called relational values. They're preferences, principles, and virtues that involve relationships with nature. You can think of them either at the individual level, notions that a place is important to who I am as a person. Ottawa, over the course of this year of my sabbatical, has absolutely taken on that kind of a role for me. Ottawa and Gatineau and Mare Blue Bog and, Rideau Canal and a bunch of other places. But my care, my action or practice of care for the land fulfills me as a person. It's a notion of stewardship and eudaimonia. Or that it's just the right thing to do to practice stewardship, to keep the land healthy. That's a virtue or a principle, again, about stewardship. All of these values you can also think about in terms of the human collective, about our relationships with people, and how, as a group we can share some of these values, or we can have values about social cohesion that necessarily involve expressing those and practicing those in nature. These are powerful reasons, and they have implications for all of what we do in an environmental context. For a long time, I argued about economic valuation and a cost-benefit analysis, and how it, as a tool for environmental conservation, it is always going to be incomplete. Now, you can understand that argument even better through the lens of relational values. The way that economic valuation works in such contexts as cost-benefit analysis is that you effectively need to add up values that are economic, that are, in a sense, the kind of based on aggregate willingness to pay. These are effectively normative judgments that economists assume are the function of a set of preferences that are held by those individuals. A few years ago, actually almost 2 decades ago, Mark Sagoff expressed this point quite convincingly, I found. He didn't actually call them principles, but he argued that these normative judgments about willingness to pay are actually a function of diverse set of values. Not only preferences, but also, what he called consumer preferences, but also what he called citizen preferences, or what I would call principles and held values and relational values. So both, I'm not going to get into the terminology there, but I'm happy to clarify that as we go. Examples of this are the notion that I believe strongly in strong sustainability, that no species should be let to go extinct. And so if you ask me how much I'm willing to pay to prevent a species from going extinct, I would say that's crazy. I shouldn't have to pay anything. This is something that we should all be ensuring is just normal course of business. On the other hand, many Canadians and even more US residents believe strongly that there ought to be no new taxes. So if you ask the question about how much they're willing to pay in the form of a new tax, even if they are strongly committed to the notions of sustainability, they may answer 0, right? And both a response of infinity and a response of 0, both of those get tossed out entirely in the effort to kind of stranglehold these normative judgments to express only economic values. Of course, they don't only get distorted through zeros and infinity responses, but also through the conflation of our principles along with preferences, assuming that they operate in the same kind of way. They don't. So relational values offer an opportunity to cross a great divide between the kind of old guard view of conservation as preservation and the new guard view that is associated with ecosystem services and using nature for human benefit primarily. Relational values, as preferences, principles, and virtues associated with relationships involving nature, offer a bridge and a kind of transcendent opportunity for these two other classes of values, the intrinsic and the instrumental. A good example of that is the case of sacred sites, where from an intrinsic perspective, a sacred site is sacred for reasons that have nothing to do with people, right? Which is very strange to those people for whom a site is sacred because of, kind of religious beliefs. An instrumental perspective would argue that the site is important only because the protecting of that site gives people pleasure or mitigates some kind of pain. That, of course, puts the cart before the horse and fails to explain what is actually important about the site. And if you instead recognize that a site is generally sacred because of a long, ongoing, dearly held relationship between a people, a series of generations of people, and a place, then you realize that it is the relational values that are actually core to the site having any kind of special significance separate from an individual's preferences, and also the reason that protecting the site gives anyone pleasure or relieves them of pain. So these relational values have become core to IPBES, to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, recognized now as a third major category of values, and one of the most important ones for explaining why people do what they do with respect to nature. In terms of moral motivations, instrumental values are only one of those. And Snoopy here, who says, an observant scout can learn a lot on a hike. He can learn about the web of nature, sunlight, air, plants, water, soil, birds, microorganisms, all working together to make a better life for beagles. We can laugh at Snoopy being depauperate, morally depauperate in this sense, but in reality, this is what we have done with environmentalism, in arguing that the environment only matters for the kind of, what we can get selfishly from it. There are actually 5 moral foundations that guide people, and this is going to come up again, I think, in the values introduction that follows. All of these 5 moral foundations, purity, sanctity, authority, respect, in-group loyalty, fairness, reciprocity, and harm care, they are all largely relational in nature. And only one of them has much to do with instrumental values. That's harm care. And even that is not only about instrumental values, but also very relational in nature, because harm and care is effectively a relationship. So these relational values are prominent across a wide swath of humanity. They originated arguably in a philosophical sense with Aristotle, but they are very true across contemporary Western perspectives, especially, of course, back to the land movements. They are vivid in indigenous cultures and ideas of many kinds, including Tsawak and Sumat Kose. They're alive and well in feminist perspectives like care ethics, and in Eastern philosophies such as Confucianism and Buddhism. Now, you can also then take some of these values and see whether they offer the possibility of creating new social norms. And this is something that I'm particularly interested in. What we did in this was we asked a bunch of people a whole bunch of questions about values and how strongly they adhered to a range of different values. We were interested in comparing alongside instrumental values, like I care about the environment because it provides me clean air and water, which is a very well recognized kind of gold standard environmental value. Everybody shares that value, more or less. Asking alongside that kind of self-oriented value, whether a value that expressed a strong responsibility for protecting the environment could score anywhere near as strongly. We were actually interested in the kind of variation in the statements of that value and tried to make the statement strong so that we would have a variety of answers. I'm not going to show you the particular prompts that we asked them, but these are color-coded according to the different categories of intrinsic, instrumental, relational, etc. And the colors here, purple, is that this is the clean air, clean water instrumental value. And as you can see, for 2 of 3 populations, so these 3 panels are 3 different populations. The top are Costa Rican farmers, the second are Amazon users in the northeast of the United States of America, and then this bottom are tourists in Costa Rica, mostly coming from both the US and Canada. So pretty much everybody strongly agreed. This is strongly agree up at 5, and 1 is strongly disagree down here at the bottom. Pretty much everybody strongly agreed with that, but what was quite striking, really buoying to us, was that this second scoring value that was really strongly adhered to across all 3 populations, almost all of the Costa Rican farmers strongly agreed with this statement, and almost everybody else as well, if they didn't agree with it. The statement is that humans have a responsibility to account for our own impacts to the environment because they can harm other people. That's the kind of value that you can leverage into really strong environmental protection, I would argue. But it's not the kind of value that you see well represented in many policies and programs for sustainability. So I'm going to give you the example of incentive programs, in particular payments for ecosystem services. These are one of a new class of programs that have been designed largely around instrumental values. The notion is that if downstream communities rely on clean water, and that clean water is the product of the hard work of ecosystems upstream and can be degraded by the actions that are taken by upstream communities, both agriculture as well as other kinds of industrial uses, then those downstream communities ought to organize themselves to pay the upstream communities to do things differently. Those upstream communities doing things differently then yield watershed services, or rather, don't interfere with the watershed providing services to those downstream communities. And that's called a payment for ecosystem services program. They are approximately equally loved and hated depending on where you come from. The Economist declared that ideas like this could rescue environmentalism. After 13 years ago, they declared environmentalism to be dead. But many people have levied a whole bunch of different kinds of arguments against this kind of a program. And in a paper that we published a few years ago, we went through 7 major categories of these problems and then showed how a relational perspective could really directly address those problems. I'm going to introduce you to just a couple of these problems and then how a relational perspective could solve it. So the first problem is of misplacing rights and responsibilities. This bubble and arrow diagram is effectively what I showed before, just turned into bubbles and arrows. So you've got the downstream communities here, the beneficiaries of ecosystem services, that's the ES in the short form. And then you've got the upstream communities here, the farmers and the industrial users. What you've got is the assignation of responsibility to the downstream beneficiaries. You don't require governments to take responsibility in order to have action. That's one of the things the economists loved about this, right? That you could have environmental protection arising kind of spontaneously through a kind of Coasian solution. The problem, this is great in cases when you've got, say, Nestle or Coca-Cola moving in as a water bottling plant downstream, right? And you've got subsistence farmers in Latin America upstream. Sure, then it makes sense if somebody's going to profit off that clean water, if they're paying for it somehow. If the tables are turned, however, and you've got the subsistence agricultural users who've benefited from this clean water for time immemorial, who all of a sudden have to start paying industrial water users who've moved in to make a profit upstream, all of a sudden you've got a major moral dilemma, right? Where you're assigning responsibility where it doesn't belong, arguably. So what we're arguing is that a relational perspective ought to do several different things. In the first part, it ought to involve, just realized the order of slides here is a little difficult. It ought to involve all of us. So all of us in this room are participating in supply chains that are actually degrading water all over the globe through the production of through the extraction of natural resources and the production of various goods and services. And so in part, the responsibility is also ours. And we need to be involved in that, whereas we are not involved in the kind of regular payments for ecosystem services schemes. And so what we've got is a kind of shared responsibility perspective here, where we're all paying, not just the downstream beneficiaries. In fact, potentially not even the downstream beneficiaries, when what they have been enjoying is something that we think they ought to have as a matter of rights. So this is the kind of transformation that I was representing from PES, or Payments for Ecosystem Services, to RES, or Rewards for Environmental Stewardship. Now there's more to that switch than I'm going to have time to talk about today. But I'm going to move on to one of the other problems, which is the problem of motivational crowding out, which is that when you pay people to do something, it doesn't necessarily add on top an extra incentive that can then work in harmony with their pre-existing motivations. Now, the best study representing this comes from work from a couple of Israeli psychologists who are showing it in the reverse, that if you start fining people, there's a problem with that. It doesn't just add to their existing motivations. So the case here is daycares, both of which were having troubles with people showing up late. One was a control, one was an experimental. In the experimental daycare, they introduced a set of fines for parents showing up late to pick up their children. In the control, they did nothing. The fines were introduced to the black line daycare in week 5. We've got late arrivals on the y-axis. You're not misreading the chart. What happened was that lateness went up steadily over the next few weeks and then stayed up there at more than double the pre-fine state, more than double the control, and it stayed up there even after in around week 15 the fine was removed. Why did that happen? In the words of Nisi and Ristaccini, it happened because a fine is a price. People already had a reason to show up on time. It's called respect. Respect for others. It's just part of how we operate in our kind of social relationships that are core to our existence as social beings. And then if you add on top the price, then what you're doing is you're extending the fee-for-service model that operated for the rest of the day when the children were in daycare. You're saying, it's okay if you show up late, you just have to keep paying us. So if you flip it around and you start paying people to do things that are good for the planet, especially when you've got some people who are already doing those things. For example, fencing their cattle to keep them out of streams, which muddy up the waters, degrade the soils, eat up the riparian vegetation, causing losses of biodiversity both in the riparian zone and then well downstream, including in coral reefs, then you have the problem that those who are doing it anyway are not going to want to do it when you start paying others to start doing it, right? Particularly because in most of these programs, the people who are already doing the right thing aren't eligible for the payments. Why? Because the economists want to maximize small-scale additionality, right? Why pay someone to do something they've already been doing when you can spend all of your money paying the people who are doing the wrong thing to turn around and start doing the right thing? Again, this smacks of misplacing the rights and responsibilities. But another problem that it causes is the fifth problem, which is that most of the money then in these programs goes towards policing them. Because you take a set of actions where many people were doing them in part because they believe they were the right thing to do. You switch the moral frame, make it entirely about the money, all of a sudden everybody wants to cut the corner, receive the check, and not have to do the work. Or not everybody, but enough people that it's normal. And you have to spend most of your money, as happens with REDD+ programs from a carbon perspective for climate change payments for ecosystem services, you have to spend most of your money on monitoring, on auditors, on lawyers, for watertight contracts and for the mechanisms to figure out who's cheating and to punish them if they are. Most of the money in these schemes doesn't go towards on-the-ground ecosystem change. It actually goes towards forcing people to do something that they already wanted to do for their own reasons. So the 7 classes of problems, we came up with little monikers for each of those 7 problems. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we can return to it later. I can share the paper that it's based on. Not all programs were designed in such a strictly kind of neoclassical economic perspective. Occasionally, accidents happen, and those accidents can be good. Bush Tender was a program of the state of Victoria in Australia. And that program was again actually designed by economists. They thought, well, if we designed the Payment for Ecosystem Services program differently, where the state, it was effectively a reverse auction, where the state was accepting proposals and then funding a small set of them. Then the thought was we can maximize competition between the landowners such that they're underbidding each other for the provision of services for money. They were a bit afraid of the possibility of collusion, that because of the spatially localized nature of bushland protection, for example, if you've got some endangered species of amphibian that lives only in one valley and the three farmers know each other well, and they all say to each other, let's all ask for double what we were going to ask because they are going to have to work with one of us, right? Well, that didn't actually happen. And what happened instead was that many farmers subsidized their bids significantly with, or landowners, not only farmers, with their own labor and sometimes even their own material, right? Again, because many of them already wanted to do these things, and the state was all of a sudden offering some extra help to make it happen, right? Farmers love putting in fences already. They don't need to be told to do it for the sake of the environment. It's already good for lots of other reasons, including because it helps them take care of the land that they care about and love. The last thing that comes about, which is really potentially powerful, is that when people do put a lot of their own time, money, and resources into something that is labeled partly about land stewardship or environmental protection, then in order to reconcile the kind of cognitive dissonance of why would I put all of my own time and money into this for free when I could be doing rent-seeking kinds of behaviors that maximize my profits, the way of avoiding that cognitive dissonance, reconciling that contradiction, is to own the fact that I am a steward of the land, right? I don't only do things for money, which then can work in reverse against that motivational crowding out and build the kinds of norms and identities that we ought to really care about. So in my work, as Lalith mentioned, I'm trained in ecology, also policy and ethics. And, for a long time, I've been kind of beating on this drum that we cannot forget values in the design of these programs and policies. We're not going to achieve sustainability. This is perhaps a sneak peek to one of the key messages from the global assessment chapter that I led. Unless we foster ecologically sensitive behaviors, sure, but alongside those, the norms and identities that really fuel those behaviors, right? And that's all about relational values. And so the transformation here is one from payments for ecosystem services, past reverse auctions, all the way to thinking about rewards for land stewardship. So phrasing the question for land stewards is, land steward, how can we help you do more, right? Acknowledging explicitly that they're already doing something good for the planet just through their identity as they are. And if you do that, if you reward the stewardship and not an output, then you solve the first problem of new externalities. If you're paying the steward and not the polluter, you're putting the rights and the responsibilities where they belong. If you have a co-payment, as I described before, then you can crowd in the motivations rather than crowding them out through the avoidance of cognitive dissonance that I described. And then if you are focusing on the kind of fairness of the program as a whole, then you can have people who are in it for the right reasons who don't want to cut the corners, right? And if they don't want to cut the corners, then you don't need to spend most of your time and money on the really costly monitoring, but rather potentially rely on a kind of honor code system with peer monitoring. All right, I'm going to skip over the last two because I didn't really talk about them. But there's much more detail on how this all works in the paper, where we lay out, you can't really see this because I should have reduced. Yeah, I won't mess with that now. You can kind of see it. the problem, the suggested shift, and then the tools for a new approach. And then layered on top of this here from a values perspective, these are the relational values that are implicit in each of these kind of solution, parts of the solution. All right, I'm going to pause there for a minute just to let you relax. If you want to stand up and stretch for a second, maybe that'll help. Because I'm going to switch gears. That was all about the incentive programs. And those are an important but relatively limited tool in this policy toolbox for sustainability. Now I'm going to turn towards a range of other kinds of tools for sustainability. Thinking in the same kind of way how a relational approach could empower these tools to work much more effectively, but then also thinking about how we can relate these tools together in order to unleash them for sustainability. The next one up is certification programs. The way that certification programs, like the US or USDA organic label or the Canadian equivalent, but the US one came first and really set the stage for all kinds of other labels. The way that these work is actually quite powerful in trying to transform supply chains. And they are a primary mechanism by which sustainability is kind of, moved towards. So what they do is they take a supply chain like this that is fat, and its fatness is really important because that economy of scale is what enables goods and services to be cheap. And, Chandran, I'm sure will go on about this if we get into this conversation, but the kind of obsession with cheap goods is a big part of the problem with consumption. Nevertheless, unless we can fix that problem, then we've got to find a way to work with it. Certification programs, unfortunately, work at odds with it and make the problem worse. Because what they do is they ruin the economies of scale by splintering off a separate supply chain that has to be separate at every stage in the supply chain, such that the goods are often sitting for much longer. Your apples and your celery is sitting for much longer on the shelf because there are fewer people buying it, there's less turnover. It's therefore much more expensive because of all the inefficiencies to maintain that supply chain everywhere. You need a separate set of marketers as well because people need to know not only what an apple is, which they already know, but that an organic apple is different and they ought to pay more for it. Right? So all of these inefficiencies get introduced such that these certification programs are much more costly, as well as the fact that they are greatly restricted in choice. All kinds of products, you can't just get your product in organic, right? You have to get a slightly different kind of product. Now, thinking with our values lens, we need to remember that this decision to purchase either of these products is again a normative judgment. Right? But it's one that is effectively, really rapidly integrating a wide range of different considerations, many of which are consumer preferences and some of which are citizen preferences, principles, right? What the organic and other labels are asking people to do is to trump all of their other preferences with the one principle that it ought to be organic, right? Throw out your concerns about cheapness, right? About convenience, about freedom of choice across the whole spectrum of goods, and pay a lot more for something that just happens to be organic. Now that works for some of us. I do pay for organic a lot of the time, and a bunch of other labels, but the problem is that it doesn't work for everyone. Some people can't afford to pay, other people don't know enough about why it might be better that they want to, or it's just too complex a decision to integrate all of these considerations together. So what you've got is that certification is much more costly. It still has residual impacts. Organic products aren't perfect, right? They still entail all kinds of land use and impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. As I said, they also restrict choice. But arguably one of the most important issues is that there is a complete proliferation of these labels that is a cacophony to consumers, right? There are way too many issues. Every single one of those issues is too complex for most people, and the solutions are too contentious. So I don't want to embarrass anybody here, but rather just illustrate how difficult this is. Among these labels, there are 2 forest product certifying labels, one of which was the original. It was a third-party verified, NGO-led, but industry-involved, substantial label for forest products that ensures chain of custody, which prevents problems of illegal logging getting into the lumber stream, etc. It's not perfect, but it's sure as heck better than nothing. The other label is an industry knockoff, intentionally intended to obfuscate, doesn't have chain of custody, no NGO involvement, far weaker in standards across the board. Which is which? We have FSC and SFI.
I'm guessing the knockoff is the one in the corner.
Yeah. You're correct. But how many people, hands up, how many people knew that with confidence? All right. So a small number, right? And that's totally fair and appropriate, right? The problem isn't you. You can't be expected to keep track of this stuff for all of these different labels. The problem is that we're relying upon consumers to be omnipotent, effectively, omniscient in terms of their understanding and then also their willingness to pay. This cannot be the primary mechanism by which we attain sustainability. Certification contributes to this cacophony. And because of the residual impacts, it relies upon a less bad logic that is not motivating to most people. And then because of the whole range of these different things, the restriction of choice, the costliness, the less bad logic, what it also does is it means that the only people who are willing to take most of these actions are card-carrying environmentalists. And that's a big problem. Because what it means is that the rest of the world, who can't necessarily either pay or sort out the complexity of all of these decisions, looks at those of us who are like effectively climbing the mountain of sustainability, and they are not empowered or inspired by that. They are actually turned off, and they choose instead to say, look, if that's what it takes to be an environmentalist, then that's not me. And this is why, although you've got a huge number of people who express strong values of environmental responsibility, a tiny fraction of people are actually participating through these costly mechanisms. I'm gonna jump through this section on consumers. It's an interesting segue. If anybody wants to ask about it, we can come back to it. It's, in a nutshell, this section is intended to address those who say, well, consumers aren't willing to pay more. And I've got tons of answers to that, and some of them are represented in one of the slides. It really depends on how you ask it. If you ask the question in the right kind of pay, even consumers that you would think ought not to care because they're frugal and because the issues are complex, actually really do care. And they're willing to pay a huge amount. And that's what this graph shows. But I'm going to just skip it, take my word for it for now. We can come back to it in the question period. The question, this fundamental question that we need to answer on the cusp of this thinking about certification is, if so many people really do care about the environment, right? Not necessarily like more than their jobs, more than feeding their children, like not that much maybe, right? But they do, they care about it to some degree. If they do, then how do we leverage that in the form of real action that serves sustainability? Well, that value action gap, I would argue, it's been solved before. And what it takes is effectively that taking action is easy, enjoyable, and not too expensive. And so this is the smartphone effect, really, right? Smartphones were nothing until about 10 years ago. And then within a span of a few years, there was a complete transformation of the cell phone market. And in fact, a lot more people got cell phones as well, even though they were more costly. And why? Because it allowed people, it was easy and it was enjoyable for people to do things that they already wanted to do. Now, in this case, it wasn't morally motivated. But I'm going to argue there's not actually a fundamental difference. And that if we provide the mechanisms for people to express their kind of moral sentiments in the same kind of easy, enjoyable way, then we can have the same kind of a transformative effect in the market. And that's going to happen perhaps because many people can't even identify as concerned until they can take action. So what we need to do is to make that possible. And now we segue again from consumption towards thinking about more government-led approaches. For a long time, I believed, because I was told, that sustainability was going to happen through spatial planning, through ecosystem-based management, through other kinds of approaches that recognize that we've got multiple human activities and industrial sectors all operating, thank you, Gabrielle, in the same space, having impacts on the ecosystems that provide multiple streams of benefits for humanity. This is true, and there's a lot of promise in these kinds of approaches. And so I set off studying a bunch of them. But what I found, unfortunately, was that they effectively require that the implementing government agencies be well-resourced, enlightened, have legitimacy, and the power to enforce action. And what I've found is that in many cases, you don't have all of those things together. In some cases, you've got very balanced, enlightened decision makers who don't have power, such as the West Coast Aquatic or the Regional District of Mount Waddington, where issues of salmon farming are prominent, but have cast such a pall over the politics of those places that issues of salmon farming up until just a couple of years ago were completely untouchable by municipal governments and regional planning efforts. Or, in the case of what was widely considered to be Canada's best chance at ecosystem-based planning in a marine context, it was called PNCEMA, for the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area. Well, so about 8 years ago, 7.5 years ago, it was in full planning mode. The government had received, this was the Harper government, had received a grant from the Moore Foundation to do this kind of a planning process for these human activities up in the basically the west coast north of Vancouver Island. Unfortunately, the Harper government heard a conspiracy theory that this whole planning process was an effort of American philanthropists to landlock Canadian oil, which was completely crazy for all kinds of reasons. One, because the lobbying of the shipping and oil and gas industries had already removed either transportation or oil and gas from the planning process at all. The planning process didn't even have jurisdiction over those industrial activities. And yet, that conspiracy theory had enough force, in part because, well, for a range of reasons I can get into later. It's an interesting story, but I shouldn't get distracted. So the Harper government returned the $8 million to the Moore Foundation and set about doing their planning independent of the participatory process, such that there was a participatory process that didn't have the folks, the implementers, separate from the implementing planning process that didn't involve anybody. What this means is that place-based approaches, although they have multiple pros in the form of being able to manage multiple activities and cumulative impacts, they are significantly constrained by politics and by the time and resource intensity of the efforts, such that even when they are done right, so even if you imagine these planning processes excluding really damaging activities, then what typically happens is those damaging activities go somewhere else where the regulatory regime is open to environmentally damaging activities. The next up is our regulations, and I need to fix the animations on this slide. Regulations are absolutely crucial. They normalize needed environmental action, and they can do so in potentially a fair way. The problem is, and we've seen this with carbon pricing and other forms of climate regulations, that democracy favors fear-mongering and selfishness and sound bites, such that climate change regulations have been hampered and stymied for decades since we knew that we really ought to be taking action. And it's because there are already pigs at the trough, effectively, right? There are industries that are benefiting from the status quo, and they have a backdoor route to the Prime Minister's office, to the President's office, and that is a really powerful mechanism of preventing regulations from taking hold, even when they do make sense. And some climate regulations, I would argue, do. So similar to the place-based initiatives, when they're done right, these regulations also have that kind of a leakage problem that, that if we don't burn fossil fuels or pull it up from the ground, then someone else will, right? This is the argument that Canadian oil and gas industries have been using for decades to argue. Yeah. All right. So now the task is to bring together these various different approaches. We've got incentive programs, we've got certification, we've got regulations and place-based approaches. I want you to imagine for a moment a different context for consumer and retail action, just as a start, which is that if you go into a grocery store at the moment, you have all these seafood choices. You know that some of those, that many of them have significant bycatch, that they're not sustainable, and you don't know which one to buy. But you know that all of them really have actual impacts on ecosystems. But imagine instead that you go into that grocery store, and instead of having that complex and really kind of morally difficult choice, that you have an option built in that mitigates any impact that is associated with any seafood that you buy, whatever it is, right? So, and that mitigation comes in the form of a side payment. So if you imagine that you're buying shrimp, well, shrimp, unfortunately, often comes with a side of sea turtles through bycatch, just because sea turtles get caught up in the nets. But while you can't ensure that the shrimp that you buy has zero impact on sea turtles, you can mitigate any impacts that it does have through, for example, subsidizing other fishermen, potentially in other shrimp fisheries or in even other fisheries like tuna fisheries, to install turtle excluder devices that allow turtles to get released when they do get caught in the nets. Or captive breeding programs for sea turtles that raise hatchlings and then release them at a older age. Imagine similarly that with meat, you're not stuck with the choice of either not having red meat at all or having grass-fed beef or grain-fed beef. Where should it come from? All of those complex decisions. Imagine instead that you had an opportunity for a side payment that was built in, that mitigated the climate impacts that are associated with the beef, as well as also helping farmers to install those fences that keep the cattle out of the streams that muddy them and all the other things that I mentioned earlier. If you had that, you would have a way to enable those normative judgments of consumers to disentangle the relational values and to pay directly for the things that they care about morally, right? It's effectively a separate supply chain for virtue that could work with either the conventional supply chain or the certified ones. And if the payment is commensurate with the scale of the impact, such that we actually are paying to fix the wrongs that are being done, then that extra payment is going to be less for certified products that are actually better, thus helping to bring about the change that makes these kinds of other approaches mainstream. What this is, I would argue, is the infrastructure for sustainability. Bullet trains are great, but not everybody is going to ride on a bullet train, and certainly not every day. These aren't going to solve the sustainability crisis, but all of us cannot help but have major impacts on ecosystems through our participation in supply chains. So we all need a means of expressing our values of responsibility. We call this idea Cosphere, for a community of small planet heroes ecologically regenerating economies. The notion is that if we can make it easy to take this kind of responsibility, action for responsibility, then effectively we're enabling everyday heroes and starting the revolution where at the moment you kind of have to be Katniss Everdeen, right, of the Hunger Games. You kind of have to be a superhero in order to be a sustainability leader. And so Cosphere is really designed around this whole innovation diffusion curve, not being distracted by, ever more complex schemes for the innovators, the kind of card-carrying environmentalists, but also not being distracted by selling our schemes directly to laggards even before anybody else is on board. It's about the build. So Cosphere reaches beyond conscientious consumers to include everybody by leveraging existing widely held values of responsibility, by making it easy, enjoyable, and inexpensive to mitigate environmental impacts. It employs one label that could apply to any kind of product through this notion that what it involves is mitigating the major environmental impacts, thus promoting a normalization across all of these. Mitigating impacts efficiently and thereby enabling the participation of all kinds of people, lessening the divide between environmentalists and the rest. So what it does is it addresses problems of cost, of residual impacts, of the restriction of choice, of the cacophony, because people don't necessarily need to track all of the different labels because they can know that they're making a good choice if it is Earth positive or if it is Cosphere certified. That it goes beyond the less bad logic because you can be net positive through this kind of an approach, at least for major classes of impacts. Moving beyond the deep green identity and building, the whole purpose here is to build political will to then later implement regulations. And to do so in a way that applies everywhere in the globe so as to address those problems of leakage across regions. So I've got a fancy slide that I don't really have time to go through properly that lays out how Cosphere funds and shapes incentive programs in order to grow stewardship, how the one label of Cosphere can both harmonize and boost other labels, can fund and shape place-based approaches to boost justice in a variety of different places. We can talk more about that. Building support and political will to show the feasibility of a variety of environmental regulations by engaging diverse consumers and supply chains strategically, enabling net positive action, and addressing leakage and the race to the bottom. Policies for relational values are crucial. All policies are always articulating rights and responsibilities, so I've argued, let's design them to articulate the ones that are crucial to sustainability, relational values of responsibility. To sum up, existing tools in this space are each powerful. They're all important, but they're not working for sustainability when they're uncoordinated, and they're not currently. Concerned consumers are being left out largely, so let's give them an easy and positive way to express their values, enlisting everyday heroes by enabling actions inclusively. The ideas that I've explained today in CoSphere are not really a fundamentally new solution at all, right? They're really just an integration of existing ideas. We're going to be launching, we have a website already, but we're going to be launching the platform that actually enables this quite soon, initially for just a small range of products. But we'd love for you to join us in this in any respect. And regardless of what you do, I hope that you'll join us at least on the part of the adventure where we seek to make this one mountain so that we mainstream environmental action. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Back the slide that has the matrix.
Yeah. Thank you.